Buckle up, nerds. It's time for the Energy Nerd Show. I'm Bruce.
And I'm Jeannie.
Here we go.
Hey, Bruce, did you ever think that Energy Nerd Show and Tell is like the National Standard Practice Manual for Distributed Energy Resources?
How?
It's kind of a big deal. Okay, who's our guest today?
It's Tim Woolf. Hey, Tim.
Hey, folks. Good to see you.
I hope you don't regret being on the show.
So do I.
Thanks for being here.
We're excited about the National Standard Practice Manual. So we're going to try to not ask too many questions so you can tell us as much about it as possible. Ready, go.
Okay, just a little history in case you're wondering about the weird name. This manual builds upon 20 or 30 years worth of practices for how to do a benefit cost analysis of all types of utility resources, but especially energy efficiency and now distributed energy resources. And first of all, I'll say benefit cost analyses are critical because they help provide regulators, others with information as to, whether to pursue a particular investment. Does it make sense for the utility, for customers, for whatever, to go ahead and spend this money on this particular investment? So they're absolutely essential. And benefit cost analyses have been done really since the beginning of time, but they became much more important with energy efficiency, where there was pressure to implement anything. If it was cost effective, you should do it. So it became pretty important. And way back in the late 1990s, California put out what they called the Standard Practice Manual for how to do a benefit cost analysis of energy efficiency. And that manual became embedded in the lexicon and in the practices around the country, not to mention Canada, for how to consider the costs and the benefits of energy efficiency. And what was interesting is over time, there was this huge debate about how to use it. The manual proposed three different tests, or three tests that really rose to the surface as the most important. One was just looking at the perspective of the utility and what are the costs and benefits to the utility. On the other end of the spectrum was one looking at the benefits and costs to all of society. And then the one that's sort of in the middle is looking at benefits and costs from the perspective of the utility plus customers. Mm-hmm. And what happened is that literally every state in this country came up with a different test, even though there's only supposed to be three. They all came up with their own versions of these three. And then, as you know well, Bruce, there have been these heated debates for 20 plus years as to which is the best test. Is it the utility cost test? Is it the societal cost test? Is it the total resource cost test, which is somewhere in the middle? And even people of like minds with similar goals could fight to the death over which one was the right test. There was basically, in my view, almost a logjam on this issue because people would just kind of pick and choose whatever test they thought made sense based upon what particular goal they wanted. And we had this mishmash of inconsistent and not really well formulated BCA practices, that is, benefit cost analysis practices around the country for energy efficiency. Now you introduce distributed energy resources, and you have demand response, you have distributed generation, you have electric vehicles and electrification, you have storage, and all of these technologies need to be assessed for their costs and their benefits.
So then a complicated, nasty fight that's going on most states all around the country, docket after docket, becomes even more complicated and difficult.
Exactly. And a lot of states and analysts have turned to the California Standard Practice Manual to figure out how to do benefit cost analyses. And unfortunately, it didn't really serve its purpose very well for energy efficiency. And it gets even worse when you get to the other types of DERs because they all have their differences, their nuances, and suddenly there's this huge range of the way that these different types of resources are being evaluated. So that is the genesis for the National Standard Practice Manual. We put out a manual 2 years ago on energy efficiency, and then just this summer we put out a manual for all distributed energy resources, including energy efficiency, the latter being designed to replace the former. And we intentionally call this the National Standard Practice Manual because this is meant to be used across the country, and it's in fact designed in such a way to be tailored to every state's particular interests and goals. What I'm going to show you next in my first slide is the different perspectives that are used in looking at cost effectiveness. On the left of this slide, you can see the traditional perspectives that have been used as a part of the California Manual. And it includes basically three perspectives. The first one is the one in the center with the green circle, and that's the utility system perspective. And we argue in both manuals that the utility system impacts, those are your basic generation, transmission, distribution impacts. Those should be a core part of any cost effectiveness test. They're critical. The next circle outside of that is the total resource perspective, which includes things in addition to the utility system impacts, the host customer impacts, other fuel impacts, water impacts, things that, again, affect the customers who are participating in the programs. The third circle you see on the outside of those rings is the societal perspective. And that includes societal impacts such as greenhouse gas emissions or jobs or a variety of other impacts that go beyond customers.
Yeah, the societal test is my favorite test. We've been arguing under oath for 40 years almost that that's the right test.
Yes, and many people agree with you that it is the best test. However, only I think 3, maybe 4 states throughout all of the states, including District of Columbia and others, Puerto Rico, only 4 use a societal cost test, even though, as you said right away, that seems to make the most sense. And one of the reasons for that is that many commissions, and I recognize this having been a part of that community myself, are kind of reluctant to go that far. And their thinking is like, well, my job isn't necessarily to protect some of these societal interests, like jobs. My job isn't to go out and create new jobs for other people. So they're reluctant to adopt that. So it has been a very long road to get commissions in other states to adopt that perspective.
Especially climate change and public health.
And of course, that's one of the biggest benefits. And yet that has been sort of written off as being not a part of my job. And so that's why we introduce what's called the regulatory perspective. That's shown on the right-hand side of this chart, where it's acknowledging that, first of all, you can't just limit yourself to these 3 perspectives that you see on the left: utility, total resource, and societal. It's much more complicated than that. Secondly, that what's really important is recognizing state energy policy goals. And now every state has a different set of goals, but many of them are starting to become more consistent. Many states have goals regarding climate change and regarding whether to account for other fuels in your analysis, and whether and how to account for low-income benefits and so forth. So the whole concept behind the regulatory perspective is that, first of all, this can be different in every state, which is perfectly appropriate because states have different goals. And secondly, this should be the ultimate perspective that is used to define what is a relevant cost or a benefit for your analysis. So the way we frame that is that fuzzy blue area around the inner circle is what can be seen as the applicable policy goals and the impacts of those goals in any one state. And we intentionally kept that blue outer circle fuzzy because it's different in one state or another. And you might have a different perspective, and that's okay, because in fact, states do have different perspectives. A couple of the key points I should say here is some folks bristle at the term regulatory perspective because it's not just about regulators. There are other people involved in this important decision-making process. So we define the term regulatory very broadly. It includes regulators, obviously, commissioners and so forth, but it also includes legislators who are the ones who ultimately set state policy goals. It includes boards who oversee municipals and co-ops. It includes public power authorities, anyone really who's making relevant decision makers. You can even argue that consumer advocate agencies who have rights to dockets and to consumers, they're also a part of that regulatory community that should be considered and should help inform this regulatory perspective.
What about environmental agencies and environmental perspectives?
So that's a great point. I would put those into 2 categories. There's state agencies that are responsible for state energy goals, the state DEPs and state EPAs and so forth. And I would say they absolutely fall within the regulatory perspective. I think if you are looking for environmental advocates like all the agencies we know so well, Sierra Club and NRDC and all the others, they fall more in the category of stakeholders. And I'm glad you asked that, because the regulatory perspective, like many important policy decisions, should be informed by input from the stakeholders. So just as in a rate case or in any other case before commissions, you want to get a lot of evidence. You want to get evidence reflecting a variety of stakeholder views. When coming up with your benefit cost analysis approach in the test that you're going to use, you want to get input. Every state should get input from all the relevant stakeholders. And that's where environmental advocates, but also consumer advocates, advocates of specific DER technologies, advocates for industry, and so forth, that's where they get involved in informing the commissions as to what should be the policy goals that are accounted for in your analyses. So while this might seem fairly simple, this was actually groundbreaking. This particular concept busted through 20 years of battling back and forth about what's the right test. And since we introduced this, it's gotten pretty wide support across a lot of states, first for energy efficiency, and now we're getting a lot of support for DERs as well. So I see this as a simple but really innovative way to sort of bust through this sort of logjam we had about, what's the right way to look at these.
So the regulatory perspective test is the recommended test?
Yeah, and I chuckle because you wouldn't believe how much time we spent trying to figure out the right terminology for the test. We have decided to call the test that is developed using the regulatory perspective the jurisdiction-specific test. A little awkward, but it sends the appropriate message that each jurisdiction doesn't have to be confined to one of those three tests that you see in the California manual. They can come up with one that makes sense for them, using their own stakeholder input, their own policy goals, and that's why we call it the jurisdiction-specific test.
You should call it the jurisdiction utility specific test. That way it would be just. And then you could have another acronym for reasonable that would then, no one could argue with it.
There you go. Again, we had a lot of conversations about the right title, and you're welcome, Bruce, to try to get the co-authors to change the current terminology. I'm not going there.
Yeah, for sure. No, there's been a lot of work, and it is done and out, right? I mean, this manual is out in the world, and people can download it and read it and use it in their jurisdiction, yes?
Oh, yes. We encourage folks to do that. The efficiency manual that came out actually 2017 has been already used in several states. It's being discussed in many states, and there are several states that are have open dockets trying to look at how to use it. So it is in wide use, and the Distributed Energy Resources Manual, we hope to do the same. So yeah, it's easy to find it. Just Google it.
Hey, Tim, this is awesome. It's really interesting, and it's great talking with you about this. I'm sure that the audience of the Energy Nerd Show is going to be interested in what you've been saying so far, and in the 8 or 9 graphs that we haven't got to yet. So maybe that's going to be another episode. I don't know. What do you think, Tim?
That's fine. I could talk about this all day.
Thanks for watching. This is Energy Nerd Show and Tell.
It's the show that we want to watch, so we're thinking maybe some of you energy nerds want to watch it too. If you do, then hey, tell your friends and subscribe right around here. Click there.
And check
or there or over here.
Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and where else?
And the Energy Nerd website at energynerdshow.com. You can always go there. And if you want to be a guest, you can volunteer to be a guest. We love to have guests. In fact, that's kind of what the show is all about.
Absolutely.